I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
You have to realize that the powers that be love having each one of us as consumers. And if we have a gift economy, oh my goodness, people might not be making money on us. We might not be the debt slaves that they know and love.
That's from my recent conversation with Gunnison Gardens owner, Susan Wyman. She's an earth scientist, farmer, and deep thinker about what the future holds. There's a lot more to come on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Susan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Before we say anything else, I really want to tell you something, and that is that you're one of my heroes.
I guess that's mutual.
Yeah. Well, I have a very good reason for that, because you're a farmer, and farmers are among my heroes. Where would we be without farmers, Susan? Where would we be without people like you willing to spend your time in partnership with dirt and sun and water and air to feed us? So I just want to begin this interview today by saying thank you.
Well, and thank you. And I think most of us understand that without farmers, we would be hungry. We would have smaller families, and we wouldn't enjoy the freedom to go about our business and not worry every moment of every day about what we're going to eat next. So we have an amazing agricultural system in this country that feeds an enormous number of people, 325 million people in the U.S. and 7.3 billion people worldwide are fed by farmers. But I think I'm part of a new generation, if you will, a new old generation of farmers that are farming in a different way than traditional agriculture. And
when you say traditional agriculture, that's only traditional since what, about 1960 maybe? The Green Revolution is not that old.
Right. I'd say 60s or perhaps as far back as the 40s when we really started with mechanization. And then again in the 60s, the chemicalization of agriculture and really the financialization where agriculture was essentially given permission to do whatever made money. And in some cases, the health of the people that agriculture is feeding became secondary to a profit motive.
And the health of the land, for that matter.
And the health of the land. And it's all interconnected. Our health and the health of the insects on my farm and the health of my customers at the farmer's market are all so interrelated. And somehow the industrial agriculture or agricultural system seems to have gotten away from that, and those of us who are getting back to that are incredibly committed and productive, and I think our customers are a lot healthier.
Well, yeah, and they're certainly a lot more satisfied because the food tastes better. But I love that you call it the new old, or the old new, whichever way you put it. Tell me why you say that. What is it about what you do that is old?
Well, if you consider human history, at least back, 12,000 years to when humans began growing their own food instead of being hunter-gatherers, humans have produced food. We've worked in the earth, we've planted seeds, and we've harvested those seeds to feed our families. So that's nothing new. That's really, really old.
Yeah.
What's amazing and new about it is farmers like me can take the incredible knowledge that has come from science in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years and employ that in our operations in a way that is sustainable beyond measure.
Things like what?
Well, understanding soil microbes, for example. So the whole debate in agriculture of till versus no-till. Conventional ag says, oh, no-till is great. We're going to save money. We can spray these chemicals, and then we don't have to till, and then we just stick seeds in the ground. Oh, wait a minute. That's not how a farmer like me is going to do it. I'm going to do no-till because I understand the benefit of the soil microbes that are actually going to feed my plants. And if I allow those soil microbes to thrive in the soil, they'll bring nutrients to the roots of my plants. But if I till, I'm going to turn over those microbes, the fungi and the bacteria. It'd be like being in an earthquake in California. You're not going to live long if you're uprooted and through that kind of turmoil and upheaval. So I understand what the science is telling us now due to incredible scanning electron microprobes and various types of technology and DNA and everything that's taught us about the soil and the health of the soil. So I, as just a small farmer on 4 acres in Gunnison, Colorado, can take this incredible knowledge, learn to nurture my soil, and produce very big, very healthy vegetables that taste really good.
Yeah, I've seen them. They are big and they are healthy. So you're a scientist yourself.
I am. I'm an earth scientist. I'm a geologist, hydrologist, and civil engineer.
Mm-hmm. And how has that background, do you think, made you a better farmer?
It colors my world and everything that I do. I think very analytically. So when I'm at my farm, I pay attention to my plants. A lot of science is observation. So some of my most productive afternoons are walking around the farm, looking at my plants, seeing what they're telling me. Is a leaf a little bit yellow instead of green? What does that plant want? Are they wilting a bit? What's the turgor pressure in this plant? What kind of watering schedule should I be on? And fun little engineering things like I have a gravity-fed system. So how high do I want to put my tank in the air to feed 4 psi to my drip system, which is the minimum psi for my drip tape. So I get to do math and science and observation and be outside and get wonderful calluses on my hands and smile at people at the farmer's market. I think it's my calling, and I'm really passionate about it.
Yeah, sounds like a good life.
It is, especially if you don't need to make a lot of money.
Well, on that note, okay, you look at your resume, and there are a lot of big words, things that could make a lot of money.
Well,
why in the world did you step away from that opportunity in order to be a small-scale farmer like you described?
Sure. And as a hydrologist and civil engineer, at the peak of my career, I had a 6-digit salary, and indeed, I have stepped away from that. Now, the reality is right now I have a foot in both worlds. Like many small farms, mine is not fully profitable. So
like most people working in Gunnison Valley doing anything.
Yeah, we all work as a 4-letter word. We do that to support our passions. But as we're entering, next season we'll be entering our 4th year of our farm.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm spending less time as a hydrologist and civil engineer in the mining industry, which is my background, and more time as an organic, non-certified organic farmer. So why did I make that switch?
Yeah.
Well, part of it is gardening and farming have been my passion for decades. And what I've come to realize is each of us as individuals have a passion or a purpose. If you get in touch with it, you'll recognize what it is. I never used to know that I really had one, other than that I was good at science, I was good at math, so go follow this profession. But what I realized is every place I've lived, I've had a backyard garden. Even when I was a student in college, I'd feel the need to till up some dirt in the backyard. Landlords of the past, please forgive me. But I would put in a little garden every place that I lived. And in fact, my husband, who lived in Gunnison for a decade from about 1980 to 1990, always pined to go back to Gunnison. And I didn't want to go because I said, I'm a gardener. I can't garden in Gunnison.
And that's what everyone says.
Yeah, but they're wrong. It is amazing what we can do. And if you look at the old-time farmers and ranchers and gardeners in the valley, there are the folks like Jan Schieffer and Dave Schieffer and Robert Johnson and people who have just been producing amazing food for a long time. And there are the up-and-coming people like MJ and Blaine with Calder Farms and Matt at Iola Valley Farms. And you look at the Flick Ranch and Ann Steinbeck's family.
And Mountain Roots itself is devoted to the idea that this is possible.
It is possible, and their community gardens are a testament to that. So it can be done, and those people with a passion for it should be doing it. But back to my calling versus other people's calling, I really see that some people are called to be healers, some people are called to be poets and artists and musicians, and we each bring our skills and our gifts to the table. And mine happens to be science and farming. Mm-hmm. And I got to include chickens because chickens are just wonderful, and they're a big part of my integrated farm.
Yeah, well, tell me about your chickens then. That sounds like an intriguing topic.
Which one? I have 200 of them at the moment.
Wait, please tell me you haven't named them all.
No, I can't keep track of all their names. If they get in trouble, they usually have names. I have a couple of roosters. They have names. Oh, they're usually in trouble. But my hens are producing eggs, and I have several flocks. We rotate them through the farm. So the chickens are an integrated part of our operations because we do pastured poultry, which is different from the big ag calling something cage-free when you have 10,000 birds in a house, calling something free-range when maybe there's a window at the end of the house, and if the bird could see that window, it might go outside. That's not what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I'm doing pastured poultry. My birds are in these little chicken houses on wheels that we move around through the pasture. They get in the spring, summer, and fall, they get fresh green grass. They can eat bugs. They're out in the sunshine. And you can taste the difference in the eggs. Now, in the winter in Gunnison, it's a little more difficult, and I move them inside the high tunnel. And the high tunnel is a big plastic-covered structure, and my chickens are in there, and they're eating, their non-GMO food, and I can get greens from some of the restaurants. And
do you read stories to them at night, play Mozart?
No, they sleep at night, yeah. but I do check them several times a day and collect eggs, and I have this wonderful front porch egg CSA. And the folks who support my farm are incredible. They just come to my house, they pay once a month and pick up these wonderful local good tasting eggs, and it just feels like win-win. There's a real sense of community about my farm, and I feel the support of the people who are purchasing our food.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if you know this, but I had a farm in Denver, a small, wasn't as big as yours. It was about a half-acre farm. We ran a CSA, we sold to our neighbors. I have to tell you that we had lived in that neighborhood for quite some time and didn't know anyone. But the minute we put a shovel in the ground, the minute we started putting seeds in and started getting food back out, suddenly people came out of the woodwork. They wanted to know what we were up to. They wanted to know how they could get their hands on some of the produce. Would you agree with this statement that community really can't happen unless food is somewhere in that equation?
Oh, I agree. You look at all of our social gatherings. The best ones were eating hors d'oeuvres and having a glass of wine. We're centered around food. Food is sustenance. It's fundamental. I guess if we were to identify the priorities to be alive on Earth as humans, first is probably water. If we ran out of water, we'd be in big trouble. Food is second. It's primary. It's what we need. And then so many of our cultures and rituals and our socialization are built around food. And for good reason. It's that kind of sharing.
But not just consuming it, but also growing it can be a social activity.
Indeed. And it's astonishing how many people want to get involved in our farm. And they're involved in the Mountain Roots community gardens. And there are so many backyard gardeners. A lot of them are flying under the radar screen. But we're connected in so many ways. And you can stand in the store at City Market and see what someone's buying and get into a conversation about kale. And most of us are growing kale, and those who aren't, you might want to give it a try. It's a hoot.
Okay, there you have it. Growing kale is a hoot.
Yeah. And if you don't like to eat it, my chickens love it. So bring it over. They love their greens.
Well, if I know one thing about kale is there's always plenty of it.
Yeah, a little goes a long way.
All right, so it's clear that you are passionate about this, but we still have this unanswered question hanging out there. Why? Why did you decide that this was your calling, and why now?
Agreed, because I could have continued business as usual to be a hydrologist and civil engineer for the mining industry and just a backyard gardener and continued on that path until some happy retirement. But I'm also a reader and I look at data. And a few things came to my attention about energy, economy, and the environment. And I came to recognize that the world or the society or the industrial society that we're currently involved in is not sustainable. So my background as an earth scientist, when I started looking at some charts and graphs about energy and debt and species extinction, I had a big wake-up call a few years back and realized...
Hold on. Let me stop you there, because the stock market is setting records every day. All right? The stores are full of stuff. What makes you say that this society that we live in right now is not sustainable?
I think first, the stock market is an improper metric for what's really going on in our Main Street economy. I follow charts, I follow data. You can look at the price, the valuations of the stock market versus QE, quantitative easing, and the input of money from the central banks, and those two lines will track together with an R-squared of 99%. By that, I mean most of the money that's propping up the stock market has been put into the economy by our central banks. It is not real. So right now, investing in the stock market is like driving down an icy road at 100 miles an hour. Oh yeah, we're getting there really fast, but there are some risks involved. And the reality is when we look at Main Street, what the common people, what you and I and just everyday folks in the Gunnison Valley are feeling, we recognize that the stock market isn't really reflecting our lives. Instead, what's happening is we have a wealth gap between rich and poor. Our real earnings aren't keeping up with inflation, and we're actually being fed some false statistics. Well, last month, for example, we were told that unemployment was at a 17-year low. What we weren't told is that 978,000 people dropped out of the employment scene. They gave up and dropped out. So if you decrease the denominator on a number, suddenly your numerator looks better, and vice versa. And so...
Okay, so no, wait a minute. False statistics. Who's doing that?
Do you want me to sound like a really crazy...
well, I want you to tell me the truth as you perceive it.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics has specific ways of counting things. The department of the government that does the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, does a lot of really interesting ways of accounting. For example, when they look at what's happening with inflation, they may use a heuristic modeling and decide that, because there are so many features on a new TV, the price of a TV has actually gone down. When if you go to buy a new TV or a new car, you could be paying twice what you paid 10 years ago. But because there are so many features, they have ways of adjusting those numbers. So the Consumer Price Index is not going up to reflect what our real costs are. And then Social Security payments and all kinds of things are based on the CPI. And there are many forces at play that affect the statistics and give us a false sense of what's really happening. But inside, we feel it, we know it, we see it. We see it on the street every day.
So somebody's essentially cooking the books.
Yes.
Why? Why would it be important to give us a false sense of security in our economy?
Bread and circuses. So bread and circuses is a term that came from the Roman Empire during their long, slow decline. Mm-hmm. And you could keep the people happy by entertaining them with some circuses and making sure they had enough bread. Bread and circuses keep people passive, but it doesn't keep people fulfilled and engaged and enlightened and connected.
And so your premise really then is that this situation where we really don't know what's going on, the actual condition of people's wallet and the actual condition of businesses on Main Street is in fact much worse than we've been told. Your premise is that's not sustainable. There's a limit to how long you can kick that can down the road. Tell me why.
A lot of this kicking the can down the road is building a society that's based on debt. So much of what seems to be wealth increase is actually debt increase. So the money that's being pumped in the stock market is borrowed money that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department are creating and pumping into parts of the economy, and that's creating asset bubbles and stock market bubbles, and it's not creating the real wealth. Real wealth and real prosperity is, oh gosh, a chicken in every pot. Having money for shoes, for recreation, to keep your family healthy, just the real basic needs of humans and human society. And I think that this wealth gap that is occurring is separating the people who are receiving the benefits of quantitative easing and easy money at the top and the real squeeze that the bottom 90% is feeling. And a lot of that squeeze is related to that difference between real wealth, which is land and people and food and the things we have and produce, and financial wealth, which is paper and digital ones and zeros.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the Think Radio community of patrons, visit alanwartesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Well, so I know that one of the sources that you have, that you tap into, is something called the Crash Course, Chris Martenson. Economy being one of his E's. But he doesn't actually start there, does he? He says the economy, the trouble that you're describing in the economy actually has roots in another E.
He does, and that E is energy. Energy is the master variable. I would encourage any listener to pursue the Crash Course. You can go to peakprosperity.com and follow 23 modules of the Crash Course. You can take the accelerated Crash Course, which is 60 minutes, and it's eye-opening. When I first started looking at E, the energy part of the equation, I got there through the financial side because I was interested in finance, just because I'm interested in a lot of things. I read a lot. I read a lot of nonfiction and try to figure out how the world is working. I actually started with Richard Heinberg, who wrote a book called The Limits to Growth, because investment and finance was an interest and an avocation for me.
Yeah. So before we move on from that title, because that's an intriguing phrase, the limits to growth. The reason, if you know anything about it at all, the reason that sort of lights up the dashboard, so to speak, is because our economy is built on the idea of infinite growth. So to suggest that there are limits to growth is a real turning point in your thinking.
It's a huge turning point, and it's fundamental, and it's a turning point that most of human civilization is going to make, whether we want to or not. It's going to happen whether you believe in it or not, limits to growth. Even a third grader understands that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So as an earth scientist, I look at physical limits, limits to the amount of trees, the amount of fossil fuels underground. There are physical limits. So if we want infinite growth, we're deceiving ourselves. Energy is the master variable to the economy. When I talked about a chart of U.S. GDP and comparing that to quantitative easing and seeing those two variables track, you can add a variable, which is energy consumption in BTUs. And the BTUs of energy consumed in the U.S. versus GDP track neck and neck. R squared of 99.9%.
And so that suggests that you can't have one without the other.
That's right. And if one is limited, if energy is limited, our economy, our economic growth will be limited. And that's why what I recognized is if we're in a situation where we have limits to energy and eventually we're headed for a low energy future, what can I do? Clearly, a lot of people don't believe in limits to energy. They don't believe in limits to growth. Well, nature and the earth are going to have the last say. So it doesn't always matter what we believe, but if you look at the data, you will likely have an awakening like I did a few years back.
And yet some of those people can point to events, recent events, and say, see, aha. For instance, we started hearing about peak oil back in the early 2000s. And oil production was going to peak around 2006, and in fact it did. And then suddenly along came
shale
fracking.
Oil. Fracking and shale oil, sure. And actually, I would say we heard about the potential for peak oil back in the late 1960s and early 1970s from M. King Hubbard.
Right.
And as a geologist, and you look at who your role models are, he was an incredible geologist, came from the oil and gas industry, and recognized that individual oil wells go into production, they have a peak of production and a decline. And as go those individual oil wells, eventually go all the wells in an oil field. So each oil field has a ramp-up phase, a peak, and then a decline. And in fact, if we look at conventional oil fields around the U.S., they are in decline. The Gelhar oil field, the largest one in the world in Saudi Arabia, is actually in decline. They haven't, in spite of all of their attempts, they haven't been able to increase their production since about 2005. It's been steady since then. And Saudi Arabia is working on deep sea oil drilling. Clearly, conventional oil has already peaked.
And conventional means cheap.
Yeah, it's the cheap stuff that's easy to get. Back in the 1930s, you could go sink an oil well in Texas and drill 600 feet and have a gusher. Those days are gone. So then you start drilling 1,200 feet deep, 2,000 feet deep. Now we are drilling a mile deep and a mile horizontal and fracking to try to get oil out of the ground. And there are people who point to that and say, what a technological marvel. Isn't it amazing what humans can do? And then there are those of us who look at it and think, boy, isn't that the last act of a desperate species trying to get as much energy as they can? And as we squeeze that sponge, that is the earth, to try to get oil out, it's getting harder and harder. It's getting more difficult, and it's a little bit riskier environmentally. And the big concept to take away is energy return on energy invested. You can surf that up online if you're not sure about it. Energy return on energy invested means the amount of energy it takes to get a barrel of oil out of the ground, whether that's conventional or non-conventional, can change over time. So 1930s, drilling in Texas, 1 barrel of oil's worth of energy, you could get 100 barrels out of the ground. That sounds like a pretty good proposition. And as time goes on, those ratios decline to where by perhaps the 1970s, it might be 1 barrel of oil could get you 50 barrels of oil out of the ground. And now there are places where 1 barrel of oil energy invested might get you 16 barrels out of the ground. And then, for goodness sake, you look at fracking, it barely pays its way. And the fracking and the non-conventional oil companies are losing money hand over fist. And that's where the big E of energy is intertwined with the big E of the economy. So much of our energy production is predicated on debt. So we have a debt bubble that's waiting to burst.
All right, so let's talk about debt, for example, because you've talked about these lines that track together on the graph. GDP, energy consumption. If energy consumption falls because energy availability falls and GDP starts to drop, how do we service all of that debt? And this gets back to the question of why our entire economy is predicated on the idea that we have to grow. It's because we have to pay the interest.
Indeed. And if we're growing, the interest is easy. You just push all of those payments off to the future, and you've grown enough in the future that you can pay that off. And the reality is, as we reach peak energy, as our GDP declines, we won't be able to pay off that debt. Some debts will not be paid off. Some promises will not be kept.
So it's not just a matter of I'll have to drive less or buy a car that consumes less. Lots of things could start to come unglued.
It's a fundamental shift. Business as usual is going to change fundamentally. And as Chris Martenson says it, the next 20 years will look entirely different from the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. There's a third E You want to shift there?
Yeah, the third E is the environment. As an earth scientist, I'm pretty plugged into the environment. And as a farmer, I'm really plugged into the environment. And it's surprising how many people actually recognize that we are currently in the sixth extinction. I've talked to people that I thought wouldn't even understand it when I mentioned it, and they're nodding their heads.
Mm-hmm.
So
and by sixth extinction, you're referring, what are the other five?
Oh,
I mean, we don't have to name them, but...
yeah, I would say this is probably a test on a geology exam from some time back. And I'll talk about there was the Permian extinction, which was kind of death by CO2, and it was related to volcanism and various events in the Earth's history.
Yeah, really, the point is there have been extinction events before.
Of course. Most of the dinosaurs went extinct, and the other ones evolved into the birds that we know and love.
Chickens.
Indeed, yes.
And so this is not unheard of in Earth history. The point is, we're not talking about something that's never been seen before.
No, but it's never occurred this rapidly and at the hands of one species, which is basically the human. Human beings are the primary cause of the ongoing sixth extinction that we're in. In Germany, they just did a study recently, and they determined that over 27 years, they lost almost 80% of their flying insects. And these were in areas that were nature preserves. I drove to Denver a couple of weeks ago, and only one bug hit my windshield. It was fall, not winter, and the flying insects are in serious decline. The rusty-patched bumblebee was added to the endangered species list just back in February. And it's not just insects, it's happening all the way up the food chain. Ocean acidification is occurring because we've pumped so much carbon into the atmosphere. If you're an animal in the ocean with a shell made out of calcium carbonate, you're going to be struggling against that pH change. Oh, as a scientist with a geochemical background, I could go into all the reasons, but the reality is it's happening, and it's a cause for incredible concern among those who are paying attention.
Mm-hmm. And we can be concerned about that on an emotional level because that's horrible that we're having this kind of effect on our planet. But tie it back in for a second. Because environment and economy are intertwined as well, aren't they?
Well, they are. And quite often we try to grow our economy at the expense of the environment. When the environment is disrupted and completely out of whack, that's going to affect the economy. So if we pump a lot of carbon into the atmosphere and increase the temperatures of the oceans, it's likely that we have a higher magnitude of hurricanes and floods. Gee, I can't imagine that happening. But some of the natural disasters that we're experiencing are the direct result of our own actions.
So we're involved in a society scale game of whack-a-mole. Everything we do causes something to pop up somewhere else. And you've mentioned that people are aware of this. It's true. 20 years ago, climate change wasn't on anybody's horizon, or, maybe some environment geeks. Now we talk about it all the time. But there's this question that hangs over the conversation all the time. What can possibly be done?
Well, and that's where I think each one of us needs to look at what we can do individually. If you trust the government to take care of it, are they going to go enforce the Paris Climate Accords? Probably not. Is the government going to be able to stop industry from pumping carbon into the atmosphere? Probably not.
Are they going to stop cooking the statistical books?
Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I just said, all right, what can I do? I need to sleep at night. And for me to sleep at night, I need to be comfortable with my place on Earth and my role in this whole situation that we have going. So looking at it for me, I've always had kind of that bent toward recycling aluminum cans if you use them, or the basic things. But it was time for me to ask myself, what really can I do? What is my place on Earth? Can I try to contribute less to the problem and contribute more to the solution? I basically have a list of things I started doing to lessen my carbon footprint and prepare for a future low energy economy and to have a less harmful impact on the Earth and the environment.
So now we're back around to the why. Why farming? Why now? I'm beginning to see the answer to that question. But not everybody can drop everything and become a farmer. Not everybody is called to do that. But everybody can contribute something. Give us an idea from your experience, your research, your education. What are the things that people could do right now to start making a difference in this game of whack-a-mole that I've described?
Well, sure. And I should say that a couple of semesters back, I actually did teach. I taught 2 courses at Western. One was on the crash course, and we followed Chris Martinson's crash course and were able to discuss it and take it beyond the videos that are available online. So knowledge is one of the most important things that people can do, and to give ourselves permission to discuss the difficult things, to allow ourselves to think outside the box and not label people as crazy because they're questioning business as usual.
That happens.
It does. And so I say sometimes I'm guilty of that too. I look at some people in the Gunnison community that a few years back I thought were so far out there, and I recognize, oh, we are all in this together, and that person was probably more right than I ever realized at the time. Mm-hmm. So on an individual basis, I would encourage everyone to seek out that information, to have those conversations. Go to peakprosperity.com and take the crash course. If you're interested, we could put a study group together and go through the crash course again. But Martinson also published another book called Prosper, and it was in direct answer to that question where people said, oh my God, the world is coming to an end. What can I do? What should I do? So I taught another semester on Prosper, on what we should do in response. Really, that answer is going to be different for different people. Mm-hmm. And it's going to depend on our current life circumstance and on our talents and gifts and so on. It's very easy to make a list and decide, look, I'm going to do just one thing. And that one thing could be consider a low energy future. If petroleum reaches $110 a barrel and gasoline is $10 a gallon, the trucks aren't going to run.
Which the Saudis seem determined to get kicked into gear right now.
It does seem there's some shakeups happening there.
Yep,
It's a little disconcerting, isn't it? And we're watching the gas prices go up incrementally at the pumps week by week lately.
Okay, so if that happens,
keep a deep pantry. If you're going to City Market to go shopping and you know that your kids use cereal and it has a shelf life of 2 years, buy an extra box while it's on sale. Buy things in bulk. Just prepare so that if the trucks stop running, we're not in a desperate crisis immediately. Other things that people might decide to do is learn to plant a garden. Work with your neighbors to raise some chickens. You might decide that you want to have other skills. You want to learn how to repair lawnmowers or how to mend clothing. Learn how to get by on less. It's interesting, we're recording this in the college studio at the moment, and Dr. Salisbury, the president of Western State Colorado University, had his students do an exercise just this semester on giving up soda for a week and seeing how much money they save. And it turned out that in a week, if they continued that throughout the year, they could save $1,300. So each of us could figure out, what am I wasting money on that I don't need, that I could use to be more resilient for the long term? And I might be able to find ways to have more fun with less money and use that money to get out of debt or insulate my home or get a more fuel-efficient car or ditch the car and get a bike. It can be different for everyone. And
so let me just stop you there, because a lot of the things that you're describing, I could do without ever leaving my house, right? I can look at my own checkbook. I can deal with my own pantry, my own fuel efficiency, et cetera, and so on. But I want to challenge you to tell us some things about getting out of the house and building this kind of resiliency with others. Because community has got to be a key element of resiliency. We can't be resilient all in our own living room.
Well, absolutely. And what's interesting is when I taught the crash course and taught Prosper, at the start of that course, a few people thought that resiliency meant me in a cabin with a gun. And the reality is, that ain't going to get us through, folks, because what's coming isn't one little crisis and then it's over and then we're back to normal. Your gun and your deep pantry could get you through a few months. But the reality is we're headed for a fundamental change in our society, and we're going to get there together. So when we look at wealth and capital, Martinson and others explain that there are actually 8 forms of capital.
Not just money.
Not just money. Financial capital is one of them. But other forms of capital are social capital. It's the people we know and the relationships that we have. Material capital, which could be your well-insulated house, your wood stove, your welder, your garden tools. If you invest in material capital, you'll be farther ahead to come through the changes that we may be seeing and that we are seeing. Living capital, things like a tree that protects your house from the hot rays of the sun so you use less energy. My chickens are living capital. The 60-plus cold-hardy fruit trees that I've planted on my farm are living capital. The raspberry bushes that grow on the north side of your house, living capital. Another form of capital is knowledge capital, the skills that you have. So maybe you want to learn how to be more resilient. Learn how to make biodiesel, learn how to mend your own shoes, learn how to take care of yourself.
And so this brings me back to my point, though, because I went there. There was a time when I got actually fairly alarmed at what I saw developing in the world. And I was well aware of these different kinds of capital, and I thought to myself, oh my God, how in the world am I going to supply all of that for myself? How can I learn all of those skills? How can I have enough money, time, space to have all of that living capital? And something that started to sink in on me is that that's what community is for.
Well, that's right, because one of the most important parts of the 8 forms of capital is social capital, and another one is cultural capital. Mm-hmm. So social capital are the connections, the bridges that we build between relationships. I'm a farmer. That means I don't have to really be a healer, but I could trade my eggs for a massage or a rolfing session. Well, lots of eggs for a rolfing session. But we're in this together, and each one of us alone, we're not going to make it as a silo. We're going to make it with these interconnected relationships, and that's really how humans evolved anyway. Is we evolved in groups to work together.
Do you think this fundamental shift that you're talking about, that's coming? You say it's inevitable.
And can I interject?
Sure.
It's not coming. It's here now.
Okay.
I am actually not talking about a crisis that's on the horizon. We're not on the verge of collapse. We are actually in collapse. It's happening right now. And that's not so scary if you realize, well, I've lived through it so far.
Yeah.
And so even though some people are feeling the financial squeeze, we can figure out ways to thrive moving forward. It just takes a change of our mindset. And that's where our cultural capital requires that we tell ourselves different stories. And the story will be, it's okay to live on less. It's okay to have fun without spending money. It's okay to help each other, that we don't have to be so rigidly independent and going it alone, that we recognize that we're connected, that we can admit our frailties and help each other fill in their frailties and really tackle this together.
Would you go so far as to say then that a fundamental restructuring of society and how we interact with each other is a part of that? And one thing that I'm thinking about is a return to the idea of commons. You know, there was a time when certain assets in a community were just held in common. You could all graze your sheep on pastures that were part of the commons. We've moved away from that toward private property. Do you think that, well, let me phrase the question this way. Do you see evidence that we're headed back in the direction of sharing? For instance, if I'm in my neighborhood, we don't all need a lawnmower. We could, if our mindset shifted sufficiently, we could share one.
We could do that, and I think that's happening in little areas and little ways. But as the pendulum swings, what I see happening right now is a lot of academic papers being written on how there was a myth of the commons and how it didn't work and how it couldn't work. And people are hanging on so tightly to private property and the division of society and isolation and pointing our guns at each other. And I believe that that is the last vestiges of people trying to hang on to a system that's broken. So what happens after the system just completely breaks? Do we go back to the commons? Do we go back to a sharing economy or a gift economy? I actually think we have to. And what does that look like? I don't know. I grew up believing in independence and pulling my own weight, and that I had to buy my own lawnmower and my own string trimmer and my own car and my own everything, and that's what I was called to do. Well, you have to realize that the powers that be love having each one of us as consumers. And if we have a gift economy, oh my goodness, people might not be making money on us. We might not be the debt slaves that they know and love. Well, they love our debt. They don't necessarily love us. So yeah, this represents a fundamental shift in our culture. Will we get there, and what will it look like on the other end? I don't think we really know. I think we can look back and see some cultures that lasted for 150,000 years. And in that case, they were generally, that's the Bushmen of Africa. And it really was a gift economy. It was a sharing economy. And there was a lot of work to keep people's egos in check and to keep people connected. And it's all in the stories we tell ourselves.
So we won't be creating this wheel, but necessity will help us along the path of figuring it out.
It's going to kick us down that path, whether we go screaming or singing. It's our choice.
All right. Do you have any classes scheduled that people could sign up for?
Well, I do. I am teaching one course through Western's Extended Studies program this spring. It's called Growing Food in a Cold Climate. And I don't claim to be the best farmer in Gunnison. I'm certainly not the only farmer in Gunnison, but I'm willing to share with people what I know in an 8-week course that lasts from February through April with a little spring break right in the middle.
All right, and they find that through the Western website, Extended Studies.
Correct.
Okay. Susan, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Alan.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's associate producer is Kat Seibert. Music by Issa Forrest. You've been listening to Think Radio on KWSB FM 91.1 in Gunnison, Colorado, from the campus of Western State Colorado University. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.